Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Tuesday, February 6th edition of the SIG Cluster Lifecycle meeting. Today, we are lucky enough to start off with a demo. Justin's got a demo of a new project that he's been working on for managing etcd. Justin, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Good morning. So, I wanted to show something that I've been working on which I've been calling the etcd manager, which is sort of similar to the etcd operator, except that it doesn't rely on Kubernetes. So we avoid some of the problems with perceived or real with circular dependencies around etcd, Kubernetes, etcd type situations. Let me share my screen. I'm going to do a quick demo, and I expect this will be a vibrant topic of conversation in terms of, sort of expanding our remit a little bit. We're not expanding our remit, but addressing our entire remit and how we want to do that. I would like to say that this is not a COPS project. This is very different from COPS. It should be reusable. I'm hoping that at least the backup format we can sort of standardize so that everyone can back up their etcd to S3 or GCS or whatever file system you want, and then we'll be able to sort of port between different tools. And so what COPS is going to do is, or planning on doing, I believe, is get the backup working into that format and then let anyone use the manager whenever they're ready. So we're not going to force it on people there either. So I have a bunch of windows, none of which are running anything, or they were running things, but we'll ignore that. And I'm going to show you essentially what we have is we have an etcd manager process, which I will run on my fake node 1. So, what this does is I've started etcd manager. I'm binding to 127.0.0.1. We're going to use 1, 2, and 3. I've created a cluster name, and we have this concept of a backup. Concept of a backup store. Where'd it go? Backup store, which is sort of the canonical store of recovery information if everything goes wrong. We have a data directory where we're storing our data. We say where we want to bind etcd to, and something that is important is we have a notion of a quarantine etcd configuration. So we will often, during upgrades or things which we consider to be otherwise unsafe, we still need to run etcd, and we bring it up in a quarantine mode where normal clients can't reach it. So that's how we get around a lot of the issues regarding upgrades and things like that. But anyway, I will Control-C. All right, so you can see we're in a state where this etcd manager is saying that it is just sitting there, no cluster spec set, must seed new cluster. And what that means is it's had to look at the backup store. It's had to look at whether it's running etcd locally. There's nothing running yet. And it says, you have to tell me to go ahead and create a cluster. And so all that is it's a file that we drop in to the backup store, which says, go ahead and create a cluster. And so we say we're going to create a cluster, one member. There's our backup store, which we're going to drop that file into. And we're going to run our good old friend etcd version 2.2.1 to start with. So I'm going to drop that in. It just creates a little file. The idea of communicating through the backup store is that this way we can sort of separate out the manager, I guess, from the actual running of etcd. But if we flip back to that manager, pretty fast, and it's already started etcd running. It saw the backup seed. It started running etcd, and it's already actually done a backup to that backup store. So if we have a look into that backup store, which is temp, etcd manager, let's do an ls-r. Okay, there's a lot in there. You can see that we have some backups. They are date stamped, and then they are the standard etcd2 backups in this case, because we're running etcd2. There's a meta file in the top of them. The data directory has the etcd data that you would expect. And if we keep watching this, particularly in backups, then you'll see that like every couple of minutes, it will do another backup. Ooh, my bad. There we are. So we now have another backup. But where it gets more interesting, obviously we can do a put. I'm just going to copy that, and we can do a get, and it obviously works. Better work. And let's now go from 1 node to 3 nodes. So we're going to start 2 managers on our other 2 virtual nodes. They're on 127.0.0.1, 127.0.0.3. And these two are going to discover the peers, which we'll talk about soon. So they've all gossiped and found each other. But they're then going to sit there and not actually start, because remember, our etcd cluster spec said to only run a cluster with a single member. But what we should see soon is we should see it log the cluster state. I'm just trying to see if it actually logged it. Let's see if we can find the cluster state. There we are. There's the cluster state. So you can see our cluster state, the controller. So node 2 has actually become the leader of our little gossip network. We have our cluster. It runs a control loop. It iterates through. There's our actual state of etcd. We have a single node etcd running on 001, as you would expect. You can see we have a bunch of peers that are all like the etcd manager processes that are sort of sitting there ready to go. And only one of them is actually going to be running etcd, which is that third one, which is why it has all this junk in there. But that's the sort of the state of the world. Now, if I go and tell it, let's actually go ahead and let's resize that to a cluster of size 3. So we have a node in etcd, or a key in etcd, which has our cluster spec in it. You can see it says member count 1, etcd version 221 in there. And what we're going to do is we're going to say member count 3 right there. So if we do that, we've written that to etcd. And now what will happen is our elected controller, which I believe is node 2, well, has already picked that up. That was a little faster than I wanted it to be. And has decided to start 2 more etcd members. So it is going to run etcd members on the remaining 2 nodes. And if we ask for members, therefore, jq.members.id, we have 3 members in our etcd cluster. So our etcd cluster, we just expanded from size 1 to size 3. It all happened totally automatically. I can show disaster recovery, or I can just talk about it. But essentially, you can do a simple like stop of any pod. In this case, restart it. It will see its local etcd state and recover. That's fairly easy. You can delete all 3 nodes, and it will go to the backup store, recover from there. That actually involves data loss, because the backup is every minute. And so there's a window of loss there. And so currently that's automatic, but I have a list of things that we probably want to address. And what that's high on my list is to make that a manual process, because you never want to lose data without the operator saying, yeah, go ahead. The human saying, yes, it's okay, go ahead. So I'm going to skip that and go to the more interesting one, which is, we talked about it being etcd 221. So what if we changed our spec in a more fun way? So we have member count 3, etcd version 221. Let us change it to be etcd version 3212. So this is an impossible upgrade. This cannot be done because we're both HA, and because we're supposed to go via like 2.3, 3.0, 3.1, 3.2. And so what we're currently doing is, for the upgrades which can't happen directly, we do an application level dump. So we will dump all the keys and write them back in. And the advantage of that is it means that we can go between any 2 versions. The disadvantage of that is, the biggest disadvantage of it, well, it's a little slower, not particularly slower, but also that we lose the resource versions in etcd. So every watch will effectively break. And I've been talking a little bit, spoke a little bit about that to Daniel, and there's something coming in Kubernetes where we effectively randomize the resource version to stop people treating it like a number. So maybe there's an opportunity to do something there. But
it doesn't look like that's going to happen, unfortunately.
Oh, well. Okay, well, so thanks for chiming in. Okay, well, so I need to look more at what the exact behavior is, and whether we need to bounce all the nodes, or whether we can like change the resource version so it is higher than the previous ones. So it isn't, what we really don't want to do is we don't want to rewind resource versions, I believe. But anyway, more work, another to do. I think by now it should have finished. No, it has not. Okay, that is we know it's a real demo because it failed. Oh, it was my fault for holding the output. Okay. That will come in a minute then. Give it a second. I had screen paused the leader, and I guess that stops execution. I think that's what went wrong. Let's see. So, but actually what it's doing in this case, because it's a not trivially safe, oh, I think I broke it. Because it's a not trivially safe upgrade, it will do a full backup. It will quarantine each node during the backups, and it will do a full restore. And I really did break it badly. That is a real demo. Okay, well, it should come back. It might take a little longer because it looks like it has to re-elect a leader. But yeah, there's a README there. There's an overview of the code. There's the list of the shortcomings, which everyone is welcome to contribute to. And that is effectively the etcd manager that I have been working on for, well, I thought it was much less time, but apparently it's been 6 months now. So that is where I am. I'm hoping we can try to get more automation around etcd management in a way that isn't tied into the particular installation tools.
So Justin, I don't know if you're watching chat. There are a couple of questions in
cool.
chat. A couple about discovery. People are interested in how discovery works. You mentioned gossip. Does this use a gossip protocol? How do the peers find each other?
Okay, so I was going to shut my screen, but before I do that, I will do. So currently there is so we have a VFS layer, a virtual file system layer. We are using the one from COPS, but it's a couple of lines of code, and I'd like actually to move that out of COPS because it doesn't really have anything to do with even Kubernetes. Really, it should be a generic Go pluggable VFS. So there's a VFS implementation for the file system, which we're using here. So file : / temp discovery. You can bind that to S3 or GCS instead. Each one writes a little file that says, you know, who am I? Or here's my address, like come talk to me. Then all the etcd managers will gossip amongst each other. And so we use discovery as seeding, and we also then gossip to discover all the peers. I would like to have another, the discovery mechanism is pluggable, and I want to have discovery mechanisms that use cloud APIs where they are available. So for example, on AWS, the way COPS did it was we used the volumes API, and so that's a nice way of doing discovery, but it also is a way of doing exclusion. So there is a flaw here, which is if you have like 6 nodes, 6 etcd managers running, and you have a segment, a network segment, then 3 of them could form 2 independent etcd clusters. And so the way around that is either to make sure that you don't run more than enough to form a quorum or 2 quorums. So don't run 4, only run 3 if you want an etcd cluster of size 3. And there's also a basic locking implementation in there right now, but it's a little early. But I think discovery and locking almost go hand in hand because, for example, on AWS, volume and GCE, volume mounting can act as a lock. And we can say you have to get one of the persistent volumes in order to proceed. And then we can ensure that you never run more than 3 etcd managers, or no more than 3 etcd managers actually participate, even if you're actually running a dozen, for example.
So Justin, what are in these files right now? So intent discovery, is that the ID of the manager?
So ID is so this is the ID of this particular node. So it generates a node by hashing. It generates a randomish ID by hashing all sorts of stuff.
Okay. And so there's a dependency on sort of cloud functionality in terms of like VFS right now. Are there plans to make that work, say, with just bare metal or like within a DC that doesn't have cloud?
Yeah, I mean, so definitely, like this is one of the big goals of etcd managers. Like, so I'm running on my laptop, and there is the only dependency right now is a shared file system for backups. So in other words, and it's not for actual operation. It's just that you need a shared file system in which you put your backups. And in this case, we're using it for discovery, and we probably want it for locking as well, unless you say, well, on bare metal, I know what I'm doing, and I'm only going to run 3 etcd managers, 3 masters, for example. But definitely trying to keep it pluggable and relatively easy to sort of combine the various guarantees. But I feel like one of the ways we can guarantee it on bare metal is we say you need a file system that has read after write semantics and, consistent listing, which is not the case with S3, for example. And then we can have a file system backed locking protocol, a file system backed discovery mechanism, and a file system backed backup thing. And you'll probably just run that all on a NAS. It doesn't need to, etcd itself won't write to it in normal operation. So it won't be an IO bottleneck. But I've been playing around with multicast as a means of discovery as well, which makes sense on some bare metal installations, although introduces all sorts of fun in others. But that's one of those things that I'm hoping will make modular enough. I think the code is relatively easy to plug into right now if you want to try something different in terms of discovery, in terms of locking, in terms of the backup store location.
Yeah. So I think that it's like a really, really awesome project. I think it looks really cool. The thing I think would be like a real incentive for users is to minimize the sort of runtime the runtime requirements just to get a thing to work and not have to toggle with complex VFS or cloud requirements, like minimal installation to get this thing running. And it could even tie into sort of kubeadm, where if somebody has like pre-installed like the etcd manager on a node and that the master is listening on a URL, like kubeadm could maybe just feed in parameters to bootstrap an etcd cluster, and then it could sort of interact like that, right? And so we don't even need people to set up a TLS or anything themselves. Like kubeadm like feeds all of that into the manager, and then it goes from there. I think that's quite a powerful.
I don't even see why kubeadm even needs to do anything. If it's considered external, we just get the data from the manager and stuff it in that way, because I like the separation of concerns, because then it's just component A does this job, component B takes over from there and does that job. And if we're going to consider it an external thing, which is what it does, and I had questions about how it's being stood up. If it's an external thing, then why conflate the two? Yeah, and we built kubeadm to do this in the beginning, right?
Yeah, I mean, having separations of concerns is pretty important, but yeah, I was just thinking in terms of like usability, like having kubeadm like generate TLS sets and put them in the right place and not expect users to like nest that properly can get a little bit tricky sometimes. But yeah, maybe we could, that's a general UX issue that we could work on separately. It's a bit orthogonal, perhaps.
So Justin, no matter what, I want to work with kubeadm. Like, I think that it is unhealthy to have the COPS, kubeadm, GKE, everyone like sort of have their own little like enclaves, and I think it'd be nice to have something where at the very, very least we agree that when we back up to S3 or GCS or a file system that we back up in a particular format. And I have one that is a straw man and not unreasonable, but is basically just like what you would do if you weren't really thinking about it. And I would welcome anyone to like that wants to back up into that format or wants to tweak that format to participate. That'd be wonderful.
Is TLS supported in this or not?
Not yet, but yeah, and there are two ways to do that. One of which is to have it come in through the seed. Remember when we seeded and we said cluster size 1, you could, I guess, specify the certificates at that time, and we would write them into the backup store, and then we would go from there. Or I guess the other way would be for the controller to go and create those certificates. So the elected controller to go and create those certificates and put them into the backup store as well.
Right. Yeah, you could support both. Like you could allow users to specify, like manually create and then specify, or you could have sort of TLS enabled by default, where if they didn't supply, the controller would do it for them. And like that becomes like impossible then to have non-TLS clusters, right? Because either or you have it.
How are you standing up the etcd components on the separate hosts? Are you using systemd unit files to spin containers?
No.
How are they being stood up?
They are run underneath. They are spawned from the etcd manager. So that's why the standard out is all like conflated in there.
But the etcd manager, is that running as a systemd unit service or what?
Not in this configuration, but it would be, yes. Or in a pod. It doesn't necessarily really matter, I don't think.
So is it just managing like raw processes then?
Yeah, so currently etcd manager, yeah, just spawns etcd, exactly. We could introduce the separation where it runs it via systemd. I don't know if there's any reason to do that. I don't have any objection to do it. I just don't have any insight.
The main is host recovery, right? Like a host restart recovery. If the system unit files automatically have that built in, right?
Yeah, I mean, etcd manager would have to run in systemd, or etcd would have to run in systemd. Someone has to like restart it. Yes, agreed 100%. And I don't have any insight either way as to which one is better. It is more complicated to do it via systemd, which is why I started just using spooling.
So Justin, you also mentioned there's like a quarantine URL. So is that like, how does that work? Is that like a separate cluster or something like that, or? So
during during an upgrade in general with etcd, but in particular in the way we're doing it with etcd manager, we will, for example, if we're doing an upgrade from 2 to 3, we will load in all the keys. So there will be a time when etcd does not yet have all the keys. And we don't particularly want Kubernetes to be in there seeing like half the world. And so there is a quarantine. What we do is we bring up etcd, but we bind it currently to a different port. etcd3 supports binding to a domain socket, the Unix domain socket. So we could instead do that, which would be much cleaner, obviously, but doesn't seem to be supported on etcd2. But anyway, the idea being that we're able to bring up etcd during cluster transition operations and do things on it without. It's a way of introducing read-only mode because we essentially hide it. So that's.
So is that like a new cluster that's kind of like a read replica of the previous state before it's upgraded?
So it's sort of like a shuffle, but during upgrade, let me see if I have the steps, the exact steps for an upgrade. So we shut down etcd on 4001 on each and bring it up on 8001 instead. We do that on each member of the cluster. So effectively, no clients can reach it anymore. etcd manager knows where it is. It knows the secret 8001 port, and so is able to, do backups, at that point. And then we stop it on 80. When we're ready, we stop it on 8001 and bring it back up, but on 4001. Separately, we also have for restores another etcd, like an ephemeral etcd cluster or etcd node, which we do bring up to read a backup, because it doesn't seem like that seems to be the best way to read a backup in any version's format. So we will bring up a temporary etcd node, restore the backup into it, read the files from the backup, copy them into the cluster that we're doing, which might be a different version, into our real cluster, which might of course be a different version. And so that's how we do it. It's almost harder to talk about than it is to do.
It seems like it'd be at some point appropriate to consider some of the security aspects, right? So you actually, your other port isn't that private, right? So perhaps if you were to bring it on that port with a different cert, that may be one of the ideas, or a firewall otherwise, although certs seem like an easy option.
Yeah, doing certs is actually a great idea, and I hadn't thought about that. That is a good idea. The other way is Unix domain sockets, but I think I actually prefer I prefer certificates because they're supported on both version 2 and version 3. So that's nice. But on the other hand, if we're only going to version 3, I don't imagine too many people are going back to version 2. So yeah, but yes, I agreed that there is I have been loosey-goosey about the behavior of the alternate ports, both the quarantine port and the secret and the temporary ephemeral port.
What about like persistence of backups? Are they always going to reside on host, or can we like export to S3 or something like that?
Yeah, so that's the thing which I hope everyone. So one of the first action items for me is to split out the backup logic out of this so that we can run it as a sidecar pod in any etcd container, and it currently will back up to anything that is a VFS target. VFS being the virtual file system layering COPS, and the implementations are S3, GCS, file system, OpenStack Swift. There's a bunch of them, and it's relatively easy to add more. So yeah, definitely, like, the idea is that it should be the backup store location should be not of the many reasons not to use the etcd manager, I would hope that the backup store location is not going to be the one that anyone fixes on.
There were a couple other questions in chat. I think Tim will come back to yours. Chris asked if COPS is going to be adopting this etcd manager.
I believe so. It is a community project, of course, but yes, I think we want to get to etcd 3. This seems like we wrote this because it is a problem that we have that this seems like the best way to solve. My ideal plan is that in our next release, we get backups working, and at some stage we make it optional to do etcd manager. So you have a choice. And it might be that in order to restore, you have to use etcd manager, but that's sort of the adoption plan that I'm debating. I'm just remembering. Oh, there we are. Chat. Yeah.
Okay. And then there was a question about, or a comment maybe, about pod versus systemd, and Tim responded. So I think that's probably worth doing verbally. Chris said that pod versus systemd is sort of implementation details, and it's not hard to switch between them. And Tim, do you want to elaborate on your depends in quotes there so that we capture that in the recording?
It depends upon if you take on the semantics of owning. If you say there's a separation of concerns and the etcd manager only deals with etcd and does its container abstraction that way, it separates it out. But if you deal with pods, then you have to incorporate all the dependencies of owning the kubelet and managing static manifests of some kind. So I currently like the idea of the separation of concerns. I think having it do one thing well is a good thing, because that's kind of the problem that a lot of these bootstrapping techniques have, is that they're conflating too many problems together and it becomes a feature circle, right?
All right. And then the other question I think we covered, which was how services are being run. And you mentioned that they're in the demo, they're just being run as binaries on your command lines, but the intent would be to run them as system services.
Yeah, I mean, I welcome input. I don't know. If someone thinks that it's better to spawn off a systemd process than to run a process as a child, then let me know. It's certainly nice to run it as a child because you have a lot more control and visibility about it. But honestly, I don't. If someone feels strongly, then file an issue and we can talk about it, I guess.
To me, if it's just one child that you're ever going to have to care about, that's fine. It's only like, if you're spawning multiple processes that you actually want to reconsider. But yeah. Yeah,
it is mostly one child. The exception being when we are in the middle of a recovery and where you have the ephemeral etcd. But that to me feels like a process we wouldn't want to put into systemd anyway. The ephemeral etcd.
I added a question. So we have a script right now in the etcd pod, at least the one that we run on GKE, that will do a migration if you set some environment variables between etcd2 and etcd3 as part of the upgrade. And I know it was sort of specific to the etcd2 to etcd3 migration because that was sort of a stop the world migration, and it did not work for multi-instance etcd necessarily, or at least it was never tested in that scenario. But I'm curious how you think this solution compares to sort of continuing along that path and making the existing solution we have more robust.
Yeah, I mean, so this in my mind is migrate if needed, but with coordination across the members of the cluster, and doing that without having a centralized, without like creating another turtle, right? So like using the gossip approach to discover nodes, doing what I call like a loose leader election or a weak leader election, and then pivoting to etcd for the strong leader election. So this is yeah, I mean, it's the same approach. It's I mean, it should be the same. I think that they do. I think they do an in-place upgrade. I think one of the things I wanted to figure out is when we should and should not do an in-place upgrade versus the dump the keys and put them back in approach, and exactly what the consequences are in terms of what happens if you mess around with resource version behind Kubernetes back. Is it sufficient to restart API server? Like, what happens exactly? That's a bit.
Cool. Then Nick put a question in chat, or I guess a comment that he agrees with Tim about reducing conflation in the bootstrapping process. And Sri has a question about how this sets up HA across instances and how we discover peers. And I think we covered that a little bit, but it might be worth reiterating since.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the idea is that the peers will discover, the etcd managers will discover each other. They elect one of them to act as the controller. The controller looks and sees what the desired state of the cluster is in terms of HA or not HA, and adding and removing nodes. Oh, I didn't show that, but yeah, we can add and remove nodes. And we can, and if we should be running an HA cluster and we're not, it will pick 3 peers, and we'll go and make gRPC calls to each one of them to ask them to start an etcd cluster, and it effectively is a static configuration that is controlled by the leader controller. So it's the, in terms of etcd, we say go do a static configuration with these 3 members, and the discovery of, or the configuration of those 3 members is controlled by the controller, the leader controller.
How does, sorry, you said with gRPC, so I mean, are the controllers on different nodes listening on a port? Is that how it works?
Yeah.
So is that like secured with TLS? Because like otherwise I could just spawn if I know that port, right? That is another one to add. Good point to add to the to-dos, which is to make sure that that we are always running TLS on gRPC. Yes, and then of course we need a key there, yeah, I think a key is probably easier than a password type thing. And yes, LavaLamp. So LavaLamp had an interesting comment, which is that we are effectively recreating the Kubernetes concepts. And I think that is true. I'd say we are recreating the minimum that is required to not have a circular dependency on etcd, or to not have a perceived circular dependency on etcd. And
yeah, I guess I'm just not that worried about a circular dependency.
I think that,
this is a much wider discussion.
Yeah.
There are opinions, TM, of lots of different people. I'm also, I mean, my concerns aren't necessarily dry. Mine are more to do with process control and spawning. Essentially, like becoming like a poor man's kubelet. That's my concern in terms of if there's node failure.
Yeah, I think if you're running stuff not inside kubelet, then you're going to rebuild large parts of kubelet, and you're going to rebuild large parts of our monitoring stack. There's just so much stuff that Kubernetes does for processes.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Certainly an option is to run etcd manager, which then spawns etcd as a static pod. So kubelet would do that. That is one of the 3 or 4 like obvious configuration options. So currently, at least in COPS, we run etcd as a static pod, and so instead we just run etcd manager as a static pod.
But it would still spawn etcd inside of that same static pod as opposed to creating a separate pod, because I think there's some advantages of having etcd in its own pod, sort of as a process within a pod, where you get things like resource isolation to some degree there, and process management by the kubelet, which I think is what.
And logic. Yeah. We would avoid recreating the kubelet aspects, but yes, we are certainly recreating the discovery and scheduling and.
Yeah, I don't think it's a good idea to recreate discovery and scheduling. They're not easy problems, and like.
I mean,
this project's been running for 4 years, and we still don't have it perfect, right?
Yeah, but we also don't have a one for etcd either that we consider better. I mean, I think if there's another project that is doing it, that's great, but I don't think we have one.
But that's not an argument in favor of this particular solution, right?
True, it's an argument in favor of like here is a solution and it is the best that I know of.
What if we were to consider, borrowing some of Kubernetes functionality, like a subset of kubelet?
That's a terrible idea. Let's just stop. Sorry, I don't want to cut you off there, but like I've been in the kubelet code in depth, and that's a non-trivial thing to do. Yeah, I appreciate the input, but I think that would just be a lesson in pain.
That's right. I mean, that's why I was saying it. Really, I was sort of leading up to that. It kind of can become really complicated, and I think at the moment it's a fairly simple piece, and that's something to be appreciated about it, right? That's like perhaps we don't need all of the complicated parts to enable a lower level piece that is required before we can run a complicated piece.
That's the part where I was going back to systemd aspects, because systemd has all the tooling to do low-level system management of processes and quarantining and isolation and monitoring. I mean, the kubelet arguably reinvented pieces of systemd versus flipping that argument, right? So if you do that, you get the pieces without having to inherit the world.
Yeah, that makes sense. Or perhaps a container runtime like containerd or cryo or whatever.
Does Kubernetes only run on systemd systems?
Practice.
No.
I believe it runs on many different systems, so that's another reason to write things in terms of things that kubelet can run. Otherwise, you have to support all the systems that Kubernetes can operate on.
I mean, I think in practice, all the installers have targeted systemd, but I feel like it doesn't necessarily particularly like what Chad wrote in chat, where we have systemd, kubelet container engine etcd manager, or systemd running etcd manager directly. I think those are fine alternatives, and different people will probably choose different mechanisms based on their preferences. I think the more concerning thing, in my opinion, is the idea that we are to me is a Lavalanche point is very valid, and I mean I just don't know what the alternative would look like, I guess. Like the alternative to something like the etcd manager, or what it would really look like. And where would you like to go? Should we? I mean, there's a GitHub repo for further discussion. If it's GitHub repo type things, we can talk about it in SIG cluster lifecycle Slack. Those are the two channels that obviously everyone's welcome to send me an email or Slack privately if they want to do that. But yeah, I think, yeah, Chris, yeah, I agree. So SIG cluster lifecycle Slack, does that work for everyone?
Yeah, I will point out, we roped Daniel in here at the last minute, and he has some sort of outside concerns from what we typically discuss in our SIG. And I think there are other people in our community that will also have some strong feelings here. I'm not sure the best way to engage them and make sure that everyone is involved in the conversation, right? Like I think Clayton was responding on the email thread, and it was probably interesting to see what he thinks. I think there are probably other people that are not part of our SIG that are going to have some opinions here. And Daniel is, not the only person in API machinery, and API machinery SIG has a lot of experience with etcd, and there are some other folks there I think that would have some really valuable insights. So we can definitely move some of the conversation to Slack, but I think there's probably some value in having more sort of face-to-face with some other folks that aren't here today to get wider opinions here. So we can try to pull people into a SIG meeting in the future, or we can do something out of band with people that we think are interested. Maybe send something out to Kubernetes dev, or follow up on the existing email thread, Justin, to see who would be interested in having that conversation.
And Daniel, would it be handy to give like the 5-minute demo to SIG API machinery and then spawn off the discussion there?
I we can ask on the SIG API machinery list. I don't know. I don't know off the top of my head. I don't want to speak for everybody.
Fair enough.
Okay, I think, so Justin, why don't you follow up with the API machinery mailing list or Slack channel? We can continue this conversation in the SIG cluster lifecycle Slack channel, and we'll take the last 20 minutes of our meeting to go through the rest of our agenda.
Well,
thanks, Dana, for joining. You can probably drop at this point if you're not interested in the rest of our agenda.
Thanks, bye.
So I wasn't here last week. I was reading through the meeting notes, and it looked like there were a couple of things that people said they wanted to follow up with me on. So I wanted to, Tim, if you want to scroll down, there were a couple of things that said follow up with Robbie. If we want to go over those briefly. Okay, go ahead.
It would be nice if we could have a canonical list from the Google folks of what are the blocking issues. I know you guys had worked on a separate document. What are the blocking issues that are preventing the GKE folks from wholesale flipping to a kubeadm type of deployment? Because I think as a community, we would like to help to address those issues, because if GKE switches there, that means that we get a lot more eyeballs, and we also can update other configurations and get rid of other things. So I think instead of people trying to circumvent or walk around the tail of the elephant, we just walk up to the elephant, just try to address the problems so that folks can wholesale flip. Because once that's done, like things like test automation and having automated blocking coverage that everyone's visible to, I think those things come with the territory of being first classed.
Yeah, so I mentioned in a comment there that at least one of the things that was blocking was being driven by a different group, by the SIG networking folks, which is running kube proxy as a daemon set on GKE instead of as static pods, which turned out to be a rather large undertaking, and it's taking sort of multiple release cycles. So there is a Google engineer who is driving that forward, but it's taking a little while. I think there were a couple of other things on the blocker list too, but I think that was one of the longer pulls. And it wasn't worth trying to burn down a lot of the other stuff yet until we had sort of the end of that tunnel in sight. Because when I mentioned that to folks like Don and Bowie and so forth, from SIG Node and SIG Network, it sounded like it was going to be a longish project to get that fixed.
If we have just at least a tracking issue that we could periodically look at, I think that would be useful and fruitful. Because as I triage the backlog, there's a bunch of issues, and understanding the relative priority and how the DAG might flow for execution would be super helpful. Because that way, if folks want to, if there's help wanted on issues, they can see like, oh, before we can actually implement XYZ, we need to do this.
Sure. So I don't think Chris is on the call, but Chris Browsey from Google, different Chris, but spelled the same way as Chris Nova, was working on that a little while back, and he has a doc that's internal, and I'll ask him if he can make an external version of that doc. I think most of the things that came out of his investigation got added to Justin's doc of the kubeadm blockers, and I think we're annotated with GKE, and so it might be that the information is already visible there, but it'd probably be, like you said, useful to have a GitHub issue where we can sort of have a checklist to burn things down.
Yeah, it looks like both of those issues are related to that topic. So if there's a single issue that we can reference in the future, that would be super helpful.
All right.
So you just want me to clean up that doc and turn it into a kubeadm GitHub issue?
Yeah, it's like a feature punch list, kind of similar to the way a lot of other tracking issues are created. They basically have like a listing of these are all the XYZ components that need to be completed.
Okay, I'll work on that, and I'll link it in Slack when it's done.
Awesome. Highly appreciated.
Thank you, Chris.
That sounds great.
Let's see. There was it says open and, this was something that Chris was going to do, but I sent a pull request for it yesterday to update all of our meeting times. I think we're just waiting for the top level owners of the community repo to get that merged. And the last one was logging / finding a canonical issue for tracking the repository split. I assume that Ilya was the kubeadmin code out of the main repo into the kubeadmin repo, or was that something different?
Yeah, the main repo to the kubeadmin repo, yeah.
So Jacob Beecham wrote a document about this a little while back, basically explaining all the steps and mentioning that we were going to follow kube control because we wanted to let them sort of take the arrows, being the first person to, or the first group to move a piece out of the main repo and sort of ensure that it's still tied into the release process in the same way as it did in the main repo. So a couple of things mentioned in that doc were using sort of build visibility rules to ensure that we weren't becoming more entangled in the main repo in either direction than we want it to be, so the code could be sort of moved out wholesale. I'm not sure if we've done any of those prerequisite steps or if we're starting to get more entangled into the main code, because it's pretty easy to add, oh, there's a constant I like in the kubeadm code, let me import that, right? So it might be worth revisiting those things and taking some of the prerequisite steps. And every time I check on the status of moving kube control out, it's like slipped by 1 or 2 point releases. It seems like we're getting farther away rather than closer. So I think one option here is to go and revisit. Oh, Lucas points out that the doc is kind of stale. Yeah, so the doc could probably use a refresh, and it needs a new owner if we're going to refresh it. So if someone is interested in exploring this issue, it would be great if someone could go sort of take that doc and write a current version of it, or maybe again turn it into a GitHub issue. One thing I was going to say is, right now we are releasing kubeadm in lockstep with Kubernetes. And one thing we might want to consider is switching to a different release cadence. So something like kops doesn't, have its code in the main repo, doesn't try to release day and date with a Kubernetes release. Kubernetes releases, and then kops will release a new version of kops that adds support for the new Kubernetes release. And it might make sense to move kubeadm to more of that sort of model, because right now, if we find a bug in kubeadm, we are forced to sort of lobby for a new Kubernetes release to be cut to fix a bug in kubeadm, which doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense. And if that's the world we want to be in, then I don't think we have anything blocking us from moving our code out, because the main thing we were getting as being in part of the main repo and trying to continue getting with Jacob's doc that he wrote was being tied into the release process. And so if we don't care about that, then I think we have a lot of flexibility in terms of how we want to position our code and do our sort of own set of releases.
I think this is inextricably tied with if GKE is going to wholesale default to using this, because the build artifacts and release process and testing are kind of in this, it's again a feature circle. If we move out of the repo, we might have issues with setting up all this configuration for how we build, test, and deploy all the artifacts together. So I'm remiss to want to do that until folks are bought into ownership, right? Otherwise, we're going to pay the price, and we don't have enough resources. We have a lot of people on the call, as I mentioned, but there's only so many people who can commit to doing certain things.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. Like if we do sort of adopt our own release cadence, then we need to make sure we can staff that release cadence and actually keep up with it, right? Whereas, piggybacking on the main release process means that there is a release team that is sort of doing that for us. So those were the only couple things I saw from last week to follow up on. Is there anything else that people wanted to chat about?
Okay. So what's the status of kubeadm release now? I'm joining like for the first time in 2-3 weeks, maybe. So do you have an update on like, I just saw in the community Slack that Ihor was worried about the low features issue number. Have someone from our SIG taken care of?
I don't care about that. I think I think one of the things I've been trying to do this cycle is not get any major features pushed out, but to triage all the existing feature backlog that we have and try to make sure that we have a way of tracking and updating over time. And there's other issues that I think might be meta blockers, which are later on in this list for GA that I wanted to discuss, because as I kind of go through this with a finer tooth comb, the long-term usability of some of the modifications that we've added over time, especially in this last couple of cycles, leads into question of like, do we want to support 10,000 knobs? And I think the answer to that is no, but I wanted to discuss that in more detail.
Okay, so how's the general kubeadm to GA thing going? Like, are we on track or?
I would say probably there is a list. There's actually 2 lists, and the issues have been. One of the things I wanted to do was to create a GA milestone for the kubeadm repository, and go through the entire list and make sure that they all have the GA tracking on the milestone, so that way we could have visibility into that. I have not done that bit yet. What I've done in your absence was basically go through the entire PR backlog and issue backlog. And I still need to finish off the kubeadm issue backlog to try and get them prioritized. What we do have is a canonical 110 list. So the milestone for 110 should be correct, right? For the kubeadm repo.
Yeah, cool. Actually, I heard about the GA milestone thing and went ahead and created it like today or yesterday, whatever. So that like it is there, but we have no issues attached to it yet. What was I gonna say? So yeah, that sounds good. So when is code freeze? The 26th of February?
It's not until March, I thought. March 14th or something like that.
Okay, yeah. Let's keep that tracked. Well, so yeah. You asked. Now I remember. You asked on a Google document why we need to change the systemd drop-in thing, and we need that for kubelet dynamic configuration. I don't know how that's going. Robert might know if you have heard from Mike Toffen.
I've been out of the office for the last week. Mike Toffen scheduled a meeting with me for later this week, but I have not checked in with him to see what the current status is.
Okay, yeah. So that is basically, that feature is basically one of the things I would consider a blocker for kubeadm GA to get that to beta, because we have to get a clean systemd drop-in which only references where to store the configuration, and then rely on versioned configuration, not passing 1,000 different command line flags that might change every quarter.
We'd have to do that for both the controller manager and scheduler. I don't know what the state of the API server. Both of those are in flux, like the controller manager and scheduler, but the API server has not been touched. And I don't know if that should be a blocker for GA or not.
I don't think so. I don't necessarily think we need component configuration for the other. I'm mostly concerned about the kubelet, because that is what's external, like to kubeadm mostly. We can manage the static pods as we upgrade things, but managing the kubelet is really hard.
Yep.
So that is, yeah. Then I got to answer that question in the meantime.
Okay, we only have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to breeze through the next agenda topic, which is, Justin, you have the mission statement doc that you had volunteered to turn into a markdown file. Please go ahead and do that. The doc also doesn't appear to be shared with Kubernetes dev or Kubernetes announce or Kubernetes users. If you could share the doc with a wider group of people, so they don't have to join our SIG mailing list, that would be great. I've tried to point a couple people to it who said that they don't have access. And then Tim, you have the last 3, so I'll let you drive the last 4 minutes of our meeting here.
The first one might be a long conversation, and we might have to punt on the other stuff. As I'm starting to do more and more reviews from a lot of external contributors, kind of doing a lot of the work that Lucas was doing, the one thing that keeps on percolating in my head, and as I walk through the code, is that we are exploding in the number of command line parameters and options that exist for kubeadm itself. And I'm starting to get to the point where I think a single canonical configuration file with a generate command is almost easier to manage in the long run and have well-versioned API semantics for that configuration file as an easier option than having to manage all the command line flags over time, because some of those command line flags we've created and we want to kill them, right? So I'm torn with the struggle of whether or not what we want to do in the long term, because I think the UX experience of getting this in GA means that we have to support these things in the long run. And we know that we want to get rid of some of those options.
What options I think about in particular? I don't think we have a lot of flags. I mean, or not last time I checked, at least.
There's a reasonable number of them. People keep on trying to add more. I think that's part of the problem.
Yeah, I've rejected most of the flag add PRs I've seen earlier of this, to not explode, to not let the public UX explode, and then we can think harder about our config API.
Yeah, that's the ideal case that I want to get to, and I think we might want to do have as a precursor an audit before we go to GA to make sure that these flags are what we want to support for the long run. I think that's probably my main kicker there, because there are PRs right now that we need to roll back with regards to pass-through parameters. The Docker folks wanted to have a no taints flag. There is the other one about the DNS policy, and it just keeps on going and going and going. So if you look at all the PRs, there's a lot of them are about adding more flags.
Well, it is possibly due to the fact that people aren't actually aware of the config API. Or not fully aware of it. It's not in your face in the docs, is it? Well, shall we take it to the next meeting, because this is nearly over?
Yeah, Sam, it sounds like we don't quite have closure on that issue, and we should continue that discussion next week. In the meantime, can we sort of put a hold on adding new flags to kubeadm for a week?
Yeah, that seems reasonable to me.
Okay. And hopefully Chris can fix her mic before next week so she can speak up instead of just chatting. Also, we were talking in chat, code freeze is February 26th. Jace just sent out an email about 45 minutes ago reiterating that is coming up very soon. So lest people be confused that it might be in March. It is not in March. It is much sooner than March. It is in about 3 weeks. 3 weeks from yesterday. So we are rapidly approaching code freeze, and there are quite a few issues currently open for the 110 milestone and 32 for kubeadm. So we got a lot of work to do in the next couple of weeks if we want to close those instead of punting them to next release. All right, and with that, we are out of time for today. Thank you everyone for joining. We will see you next week. Take care.
See you next week.
See ya.